One. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, for the International Relations Cluster at Nickel and Dime, which is the official research center for New Economic Studies, a roundtable discussion where we'll be talking about Ukraine and the threat they face from Russia. So in the panel today, we have Ishita, Tanvi, Nachiket, and Hemang and I will be moderating this session. To give you a quick introduction of the current events that's been happening, we know that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has been building up his forces along the border, where we've seen more than 100,000 soldiers armed with weapons and missiles, and we've seen armored tanks lined up across the borders of the two countries. The fear is that Russia is planning and is in the advanced stages of an invasion, and it's reached a place and stage where any provocation from any side can trigger a more serious conflict. This is why we have seen many diplomatic efforts by countries in the form of USA, Turkey, and France. And they've been trying to de-escalate the situation and to avoid any catastrophe to come. So what's behind this? Why is it happening? What's going to be the end result of this? In this roundtable, we'll try to make a sense of this entire conflict. So we'll get right into this discussion where the first question would be regarding the history of the country between the two countries. So what we know is Russia is ready for a fight. So my first question to the panelists is, how did we reach here? How did the tensions escalate to this levels between the two countries? Anyone would like to start this off? Yeah, Nachiket.
Yeah, so I think it's an important question because it is a tendency, there's a bias. We almost every time hark back to the present or recent moment while discounting the history. So keeping the historical context in mind, I think it's mostly the result of how Cold War relations played out, and mostly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, when these new nation states were coming in, as in breaking off from the Soviet bloc. And then too, Russia was the most powerful country in the Soviet bloc, and Ukraine was just another, like other socialist Soviet republics. It was just one of the components. But I think what is important to note here is that how Russia has historically behaved in that sense, because it has a very paternalistic instinct towards all these other countries in the bloc. Another reason is about how Russia thinks in a zero-sum way, mostly. For Russia, most conflict is zero-sum, as in for many other countries. But it's important to understand with regards to, because for it, it's either a complete gain or a complete loss. So that is another factor which explains how historically Russia has behaved towards these smaller countries in the region. Also, another thing to note is that Russia is the key player, has been the key player in Eastern Europe, while there has been an expansion of Western influence, which we'll talk about later. But there is still there is still a strong idea that Russia is the major key player in that region, and flowing from it, I think this is not so much about ideological conflict, but about the failure of nation building in some senses, which did not happen quite appropriately, and Putin in some ways wants to renegotiate the 1990s. I would say that.
I think Ukraine has started to threaten Russian revisionism in a manner, like Nachiket said, Russia is operating with a zero-sum mentality. And I feel like now it's just come down to being a battleground between the Russia and the West. And NATO becomes a flashpoint there. But the other thing is that Russia is keen to not let Ukraine get aligned, and it is visibly trying to push back or build up the security theater in order to deter this behavior of Ukraine supposedly or seemingly aligning more with the West by demanding like a membership in the NATO, and just a general discontent is being showcased by this Russian action towards NATO being expanded eastward.
Yeah, Ishani, go ahead.
Yeah, along with what Nachiket and Tanvi have pointed out, another thing that I feel which actually stems from the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union and Russia being a very powerful nation as compared to the other countries is that Russia has always wanted to, meddle in the internal politics of the Eastern European countries. That has always been the case, and it was very evident with what happened in 2014 when there were like Russian backed troops, and which led to the annexation of Crimea and everything that happened. Considering that all of that was within Ukraine's internal politics, and it like Ukraine had the right to um, take control of that, but given that Russia meddled into its internal politics, shows that Russia always was keen on not letting its uh, former Soviet Union countries get away with having like an independent country and moving towards democracy or something. So, stemming from that, I think the present situation does have a link wherein you can see that Russia has always tried to intervene in the politics and internal relations of its former Soviet Union countries.
I also feel there's a level of anxiety from Russia's side, which stems from the fact that you have a lot of Russians living in Ukraine, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine. And there's a growing belief that he's actually scared of the democracy that Ukraine has enjoyed ever since the splitting of the Soviet Union. So that's why you have a predominant region in eastern Ukraine where you've seen a part of it being taken control by pro-Russian supporters. Separatist movements have been taking place since 2014. And what we've noticed there is, even though Russia's denied it, Russia has supplied weapons and troops for helping them, which has now resulted in a bloc that is created separately just for pro-Russia movements in that country. So I feel even that is a big part of it. I mean, we've noticed that with Russia and Putin in general, where he's had a growing sense of anxiety with regards to how the neighboring countries around him are enjoying a pro-democracy movement, even though most periods we've seen that they've had pro-Russia governments till very recently. This comes with Georgia, Belarus, or Kazakhstan in recent history. So I feel that is another interesting aspect to think of about how he wants, like someone mentioned, that Moscow does not want to let go of Ukraine because of it feels like it's still a part of it. It's like a brother nation for them. So I think 2013 being the recent history where we've seen, and there's a growing belief in Ukraine that also means that we've been on the edge since 2013, 2014, where the escalations have taken place. And this was bound to happen more or less now. Anyone else wants to add anything to this? Or shall we move on to the next question?
Okay, so
Yeah, Hemang.
all the points which were raised here were pretty good and valid. But the point to note here is that NATO has been expanding in the Eastern Europe region for last 20 years. So why their expansion is such a threat to Russia now? That would be my next question to you all.
I think Ukraine has a lot of strategic significance for Russia, not just because of its access to like the Black Sea and shipping routes, but I feel like just the overall sort of historical ties. Like Rakshan pointed out how there is a Russian speaking population in the East, and in the West, there's a Ukrainian speaking population, which definitely shares a different conception of nationalism, which is why they've moved on not so much a democracy, but a hybrid regime that they enjoy. And what Putin just wants to do, in my understanding, is to let them know that you can't really get away with having a democratic revolution without having any serious consequences. And I feel like 2014 Crimea was in part a manifestation of a lesson he wanted to teach in that manner. And the concerns and the reservations that he does have, that there might be spillovers in Russia where he has to consolidate his stronghold, are ever growing, right? and NATO might have been expanding eastward, but I feel like the recent, I mean, Ukraine particularly for like from like a strategic point of view, and given the history of like 2014, even if it's, you know, the coming about of the Minsk agreement or the, I mean, just the manner in which it is unfolded, it just becomes collateral that is painting a picture of Russia versus the West. And Russia just wants to push back against that. It wants to maintain its stronghold in the region and its post like former Soviet republics. And I think from my understanding, it's just about like Ukraine just signifying something more than just, you know, eastward expansion, but also signifying how strong Russia really is in its so-called geographical region.
I think geography.
Adding on.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry.
My bad. No,
Okay,
go ahead.
so adding on to what Tanvi just said, I agree with her 100%. And I would like to put it in a little different way. What I feel is that Russia is definitely a little apprehensive of the hard power of the NATO, and that is through, you know, NATO being present in Ukraine, or not just Ukraine, in the Eastern European countries which are close to Russia. For example, it even said that, you know, it has missiles that can reach Moscow in like 5 minutes. So that is also understandable that NATO's presence in these countries is detrimental to Russian security. But I also feel what Tanvi said regarding Russia being more worried about the soft part that's bringing in, like that's brought about by the West having more influence in the, say, the former Soviet Union countries. So the soft power being democracy and modernization in a very Western sense. So that's what I feel, that Russia, along with being apprehensive of the hard part that's brought about by the NATO's presence, is also scared of losing its soft power, in the sense its culture, its ideals being undermined um, because of being overpowered by the Western ideals of, say, democracy in that sense.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was pointing at as well. The other point that I had in mind is the continuation again, what Tanvi was talking about is this is one particular event that we need to keep in mind is what happened before 2013, where Ukraine was supposed to sign a political and economic agreement, a deal with EU, but suddenly you saw a backtrack, which they then ended up signing the agreement with Russia. And this created a mass protest in the country, which escalated a lot. And then it ended up with the overthrowing of the then president. In the end, the new president ended up signing a deal with the European Union, which kind of gave a signal to Russia that, yeah, our powers have been diluted in this country and in our region, and we want to strengthen our position in this geographical location. And that is why the aspect of NATO comes in. They believe that it's because of the expansion of NATO towards the eastern part of Europe is what is causing this kind of power dynamics that has been reduced for Russia, because we've had a few countries which were part of Soviet Union, which are now part of NATO. So they do not want, even that's what the statements that Putin or any of his foreign policy advisors have been talking about, is like, all we want is no further expansion of NATO towards Eastern Europe, no participation of military exercises with NATO and with Ukraine and other countries that were once Soviet Union or any neighboring countries of that. So I feel that is one of the main regions, and that's actually one of the main demands as well. It's like, we don't want NATO expansion anymore. We don't want them to have any military exercises anymore. So I think that in some ways is the main crux of it. But we know for a fact that neither is NATO nor USA nor Ukraine is going to crumble to that fact. It's like, no, it's our decision. If we want to be part of NATO, if we want military exercises to be held within Ukraine, so it is our right to do so. So I think that's where the biggest involvement of NATO comes in.
Yeah, I like bringing like what you said about growing sort of resentment among Russian leaders, because they have been like, since the end of Cold War, like almost NATO's membership has doubled in some senses, and Russia wants to draw that red line, like, this is it. I mean, with Ukraine, they want to build that Iron Curtain again in some senses. So there's a clear division once again, because in 2004 you see NATO came to the immediate neighbor, became the immediate neighbor in the sense that when the Baltic republics were taken. So in 2004, when the Baltic republics joined the NATO, so it was considered like a big move because they immediately came. Because see, I mean, though the Baltic republics are not that big a consideration in this equation, but still, like, there's a sort of a power play that is going on. They still think that in their immediate periphery this sort of thing should not happen. And it's not just because I mean, Ukraine then became the like turning point, an inflection point in some ways, because that's the breaking point in the relationship. So yeah.
I agree with you all, and what I believe is that Russia has a sense of insecurity with dilution of its own power compared to West. Like for instance, after the Soviet Union fell, Russia claims that US promised them that there will be no NATO's expansion even by an inch towards each side, and yet in last 20 years NATO has expanded a lot, and like this sense of their insecurity has been growing over time. And like this, just like Nachiket said, Ukraine is the Iron Curtain where they draw the boundary, where they're gonna draw the boundary.
Yeah, Tanvi, go ahead.
So I think just sort of backtracking into like my argument about nationalist sentiments and what role they play here in Ukraine being so strategically important and sentimentally important for Russia, is that during I mean the Soviet era, Kiev was at par with St. Petersburg and Moscow as like one of their main cities. And the idea so far up until Crimea was that Ukraine is like everyone in Ukraine is our family, like we are all brothers and sisters. And to see how that is now unraveling because of these separatist sentiments and how Russia has been supplying um, extremists and separatists in the Donbass region with hopes to like push and expand into Kiev, we don't really know. I mean, I'm sure we'll come to this in the towards the end of the discussion about like whether or not Russia is bluffing. But I feel like this need to consolidate the superpower image and to have access to what Ukraine does and to historically, back up and take back ownership of Crimea, which was transferred from Russia to Ukraine as a symbol of, trust and brotherhood under the Khrushchev regime, is just a lot of, I think the word has been tossed around, insecurity. And why is that coming up to this, extremely fragile, vulnerable balance of power situation right now that can tilt any side today?
All right. So that was a fruitful question that we got many answers for. We'll move on to the next question, which is kind of the crux of what has been giving a lot of concerns around the world, which has been a site of debate for a lot of media organizations as well, which is the threat of invasion real, or is it an enormous bluff to scare off players like USA, Ukraine, and Western Europe for that matter? You also have to keep in mind this one aspect that, like I mentioned before, Ukraine says that they've been on the edge from 2014 itself, and where we've seen more than 14,000 people displaced, so 14,000 people dead and 1.5 million people displaced since 2014 itself. So in some ways, it's been a very long war, but right now we're seeing an escalation of a full-fledged invasion of a country. So do you see that as a real threat? Do you see that as an invasion, as a real deal, or is it just an enormous bluff?
I think just today, Putin has been overseeing these military drills that have been taking place on the border, supposedly as a routine matter. But the fact is that it is just a lot of dramatic security theater that is unfolding in hopes of bargaining power in this situation. And yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a very fragile situation. I personally do not think Russia is bluffing, but I also am not sure about the extent to which, I mean, history has shown otherwise, right? The extent of which Russia can take if need be in order to consolidate its foothold in the region. By seizing Crimea, Russia solidified its access to the Black Sea. Now, what do they want to do next? Is this really in hopes of like pushing back American or Western influences, or is this just about making Russia great and having this sort of stamp saying that Russia is powerful and you better not mess with us, right?
Personally, if you're talking about the threat of invasion, I feel what Russia wants is to keep that threat going. I feel it's really happy that there's a threat looming above Ukraine, that you can be invaded anytime. But personally, I don't feel Russia is actually going to invade the country. I feel that is very much in Russia's nature to keep everyone on the edge of their seat, waiting for its next move. That is something that Russia does to make itself very relevant and prominent in the global scenario. So personally, I do not feel that Russia is actually going to invade Ukraine, because considering all of the sanctions that would come across, and not just sanctions, but like given today's age, it's not say the 1990s, or it's not the end of the Second World War. It's a different time now. The world is vastly integrated, at least economically, and given then that could be like a huge blow for Russia's economy, because of the sanctions, I do not feel that Russia will actually go ahead with the invasion. But talking about the threat of invasion, I feel Russia is gonna make sure that that stays for some time, and like say the US or France or UK, like the whole of the West and Ukraine in itself is like waiting for its next move and like calculating all that Russia's doing. So that is something that I don't feel that Russia is going to go ahead with like a full-blown invasion.
While I agree, like both of you, that they might not necessarily invade. I mean, there's an element of dramatics and theatrics involved, but I think it's again circle back to the point of Russia didn't really have anything to play with. Like they don't have anything to play with for a very long time now. So I mean, it's inherently also in the nature of like great powers to start meddling with their peripheries and like just to gain bargaining power. And that's also, while I also understand there's an internal deterrent of sorts with economic sanctions and that sort of stuff, but I still feel that they can make use of this situation to their own. Like it's just like they can go for an invasion. They can like enter, necessarily not into full-blown conflict or full-blown war. They can still like seize territory or do anything of that sort. They just need some sort of like grabbing attention, to put it very colloquially.
So what I'm getting from this discussion so far is Russia is adamant of creating a superpower kind of an image. And at the same time, they have that maternal instinct towards Ukraine as well. So in the two arguments that you guys have put forward so far, one suggests that they might back off, which in some ways will bring down their superpower kind of an image that they really don't want to go ahead with, and also damage the relationship with Ukraine. But the question here is, will NATO back off? In the sense that, will they call their bluff and be like, no, there's no going to be invasion, so we're not going to do anything of that sort? Or they'll be like, there's an invasion that is really, really possible. Is NATO really is going to take off the risk and be like, fine, let's stay in the situation. We don't think Russia is going to, is there any consequences to that? How is it going to play out in the Western sense of this conflict?
I think again, like if you look after what happened after the Trump era, I think US wants more involvement globally. So there's an element of domestic politics also involved. Plus, like as you know, President Biden's approval rating are not that high. So I mean, it's more sort of he wants to like go in the open and like display his image also. I think that's an important element that's often missed. But I think again, most NATO leaders would I mean, they would also like to, just like Putin, if Putin is doing something, why should we like stop? So there's an element of domestic politics involved everywhere. So I just wanted to make that small point.
And do we believe that the UK, USA, or other countries will come to Ukraine's aid if, in case, Ishan, I'll just come to you. Let's finish this question. If, in case Russia does invade Ukraine. So we'll get to this question. Ishani, you had something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add something for the previous question that you asked regarding the West backing off. I feel like when I was reading through it, that there is a sense of exaggeration from the West's end. And it's very evident when you talk to people from Ukraine itself who say that we have been under a threat since like 8 years now. And that's why we are not panicking, which makes a lot of sense because this threat has been looming around like over Ukraine for like 8 years now. But it's just now that it has grabbed the West's attention, and given the Western media's prominence in like the world over, there has been a sense of exaggeration from their end. And that has also been made evident when the president of Ukraine himself said that, we do not like what the Western media is doing because it's affecting our economy, which makes a lot of sense. So again, like Nachiket said, when we're talking about the US and the West in general, they do have a sense of, trying to intervene in the global politics, and they do have a domestic sentiment involved. So I agree. Yeah.
Hemang?
Yeah, I had 2 points to add. First of all, to your last question, NATO has established its identity around being a defensive organization. So in the current crisis, the Russia is seen as an invader, and NATO is seen as a defensive line against Russia. So in any way, if I believe if the situations are supposed to get if the situations escalate and the war starts out, it would be Russia who would be taking the first step. And secondly, about whether the threat of war is real or not, I believe we need to consider the situation of internal politics within Russia as well. For instance, last year in Jan, Russia experienced one of its largest anti-government movement as tens of thousands of Russians protested in the support of the political opposition leader Alexei Navalny, because he was being detained because the Russian government tried to poison him in Germany. So the political scenario within Russia isn't as stable as they want to be, and if they start a war right now, they won't be just facing they won't be just facing criticism from other nations or from rest of the world. Their own people might not support them.
Tanvi?
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting point. I think one important thing that we should possibly note is that Ukraine couldn't possibly sustain a war. So Russia wouldn't be going to war. They would just simply stage an invasion and take up, claim territory like they did in 2014. What really is at par here is to consider these economic undercurrents that are taking place in terms of oil and natural gas. So the Nord Stream pipeline, which is being built, which actually supplies most of Europe with natural gas, which is the main source of energy that they have, is powered by Russia. And the US is diametrically opposed to that pipeline being constructed because they say that it bypasses Ukrainian territory, it deprives Ukraine and all the transiting states of a very lucrative transaction fee, right? Transit fee, I'm sorry. But what Germany did push back against this same argument was that, hey, but you want to do this so you can supply liquefied natural gas in Europe. You want to expand your American market. So I feel like there are so many undercurrents. It's not so black and white. Like sure, there is a threat of economic sanctions, but that's not stopped Russia before. Realistically speaking, there are so many things at play in terms of the benefits that Russia is looking at. And while I agree with Hemang's point that the current geopolitical scenario in Russia, internally, domestically, is very fragile. So I don't know if this is an effort to sort of ignite a nationalist fervor and say that, hey, we're going to reunify Ukraine like a brother nation, like we share the same soul and same mind. But I feel like NATO, where it does push back on this, there's just no uniform pushback that's coming from their side. I feel like a lot of countries, including India, the stance that they've taken is not against Russia, mostly because they can't take a stand against Russia. But the stand is that, these things can be sorted out in the UNSC. But here's the thing, who is willing to compromise? Is Ukraine still going to push for NATO membership? Or, I mean, like I just don't see this like going somewhere. Even if like talks do start, like I don't know what it will accumulate in. Even if there's no invasion, I just see hard power working out here simply because of the fact that both of these sides are pretty adamant on wanting their share of the pie, I guess.
That was the next part of my question as well. Like, how do you guys make sense of the entire mediation efforts that have taken part diplomatically with France, with USA, and Turkey for that matter, and the stance of various other countries in the world? We had a talk about sanctions previously, and I'd like to bring that back. But I would also like you guys to talk about it in the sense that keeping in mind that it was reported that Russia currently has $600 billion in currency reserve. So do you really think these sanctions that they bring in, Russia actually care about them? Will they still go ahead regardless of the fact that they have that level of backup, and the fact that what Tanvi mentioned, how Europe is dependent in terms of gas line? What do you guys make of the entire diplomatic efforts? In some ways, there's one quote that I'd like to bring up is the talks between UK and Russia, where the foreign policy minister from Russia said that it was a conversation between a dumb person and a deaf person. So that was the level of discussion that how Russia describes. So how do you guys make sense of this entire diplomatic relationships and mediation efforts that have taken place so far?
What I think about the mediation efforts is that given that Russia is very covert and like it never takes full responsibility for its actions, like till now it doesn't it says that it's not responsible for what happened in 2014 so in Ukraine. So I mean that's the first point of concern when it comes to mediation efforts, because when you're mediating, at least you need to be on like the same page where you know who has done what and like what can be done, like what can be done in the future. So that is something that has been a problem and has been one of the reasons for like unsuccessful mediation efforts, because the mediation efforts have been going on since a long time now, and from not just say the US but also there's France, there's UK, all the countries have tried that. But it's just that Russia would never admit, like till now Russia is saying that no, we are not planning any invasion, we are not doing anything at all. And even though its actions may tell you otherwise, but on face it's saying that no, we're not really doing anything. So I mean, where do you even start with the mediation efforts?
I mean, how genuine are the mediation efforts? Macron visited Ukraine and Russia like 2 months before his re-election campaign. So it's just so much going on at the same time, and it's so hard to predict like which direction this tilts in. Because after the talks, Macron was hopeful like that there would not be any escalation, and the diplomatic talks were a success with both the Ukrainian president and the Russian president. But today, I mean, just yesterday, Biden says that, threats of an invasion are imminent, and we have countries scrambling to like evacuate their diaspora from these countries. So it's like, are we witnessing like a second sort of twisted manner in which an Afghanistan 2.0 is happening in terms of how the invasion is going to take place? And I mean, warnings are being issued and there is an escalation. I mean, drills are happening right now. But unless there is a compromise reached, I don't see this being resolved with a standoff. Like, I don't see there being a stalemate either. So I think it's very interesting to just keep noting like what this is developing into by the minute every day.
Yeah,
I
building on what
Yeah, Nachiket,
Yeah.
go first.
Building on what Tanvi said, it reminds me of a letter that was published in Guardian by a person who was sort of trying to draw parallels between this point about personal assurances, about Macron saying that, we have personal assurances from Putin. So they were comparing it with how Neville Chamberlain had similar sort of assurances during the World War II. It's sort of very hilarious, though that analogy we can argue, we can criticize that analogy. But the thing is that Vladimir Putin is inherently very different from these Western leaders. His style of leadership, his style of governance, internal polity of Russia, all these things, like it's sort of there's a sort of problem with the deification of the leader that has happened in Russia over a very long period of time, which makes him inherently act in a very different manner when even diplomatic relations are handled. So we just need to keep that in mind.
Hemang?
While all these points are quite valid, I have a little different opinion. I don't believe that US is trying to prevent this crisis prevent this crisis from escalating into a war. I believe US somewhat wants this crisis to escalate in a war, because first of all, as mentioned earlier, Russia supplies 1/3 of the Europe's oil demands. So if there's a war, if the war breaks, and if the Russia invades, definitely those oil supplies are the supply of oil is gonna reduce, and Europe will definitely shift to US for to fulfill its demand. Now, from the Biden's from the from the perspective of USA, Biden's climate goal, because of Biden's climate goal, they have reduced their oil consumption in the nation. So if they are to supply, and the USA has been claiming that they can supply oil to Europe. So even in such case, if they are to supply oil to Europe, they would supply it at an inflated rate. It's important to note that right now, price per barrel of crude oil is $90, whereas if the invasion, if Russia invades, it's definitely gonna go above the mark of $100. So from USA points of view, they'll be making huge sums of profit if Russia invades. So yeah.
Shani?
Yes, just another point that I wanted to add regarding, I think someone brought up the UNSC and how the West was saying that we should resolve this in the Security Council. This just, even though this is a bit off topic, but I feel this is where the UNSC is, like the structure is extremely flawed, because if you are making 2-3 superpowers, like if they have veto, how do you expect to like ever reach a very fruitful decision? And like that, actually this actually reminds me of the Cold War period, where it was almost next to impossible to reach a consensus or like a successful decision on any, say, international issue, because of the US and the US are always at odds. So when we're talking about international mediation efforts, and with the UN claiming to be one of the, say, most important platforms where countries can come and like resolve their problems through negotiations and peacefully through diplomatic efforts, this is where UNSC being one of the most important organs which actually has the power of implementation, fails again. So that's just what I wanted to point out.
It's interesting.
I think the idea is just to like initiate dialogue and see what every side can put on the table as opposed to voting a resolution. But I do agree with that. I mean, yeah, but I do feel like given the situation, it's good to have any avenue of discussion that is available. And some scholars even say that the Minsk agreement, which is the only thing that is, you know, holding up any semblance of peace in the region is deeply flawed and problematic, and there have been Russian efforts to undermine the Ukrainian side. And now, given that the West is like continuously trying to amp up their response, that just becomes a justification for Russia to go ahead and do what they want to do.
Anyone here wants to make sense of Russia's demands with regards to NATO backing off? Do you see that as a reasonable demand? That, I mean, yeah, most of you guys have said that it might, the NATO and the Western countries are calling it bluff, but anyone who can make sense of that demand that Russia has from a strategic point of view, given the recent history of color protests and people's protests that is happening in previous Soviet nations. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if we are talking about whether it makes sense or not, obviously, NATO has always maintained its stance as being a defensive organization. However, Russia sees it as a threat, and if Ukraine becomes a part of a NATO, they from the Russia's point of view, NATO would be at arm's length with them. Within minutes, they could march into Russian territories. So from if they are seeing NATO as a threat, then from a strategic point of view, yeah, Ukraine's inclusion in NATO is preventing preventing Ukraine from joining NATO is like a strategic decision.
All right. Anyone else? Oh, this is just like an off question that I had.
Yeah. No, I agree. I feel, given that, it may seem that Russia's demands are reasonable, considering that it might be detrimental to its security. But I think Russia knows that the West is not, in no way it's going to agree to these demands, because even though it is unlikely that the NATO will expand to, say, the Ukraine, or the Ukraine will be a part of the NATO. But given that if Russia gets to decide who's going to be a part of the NATO and who's not going to be a part of the NATO, that is a major deal. And Russia knows that the West, especially the US, is not going to agree to this. And it's like just a standpoint where Russia knows that no one is going to agree on it, and it can just do whatever it wants to do.
I'll just end that question on the note that it was said that any diplomatic success would only come in the form of compromise from either sides. So I'm not sure what exactly that compromise would be from Russia's side or from NATO and Ukraine's and the Western sides of the countries, but it seems like at some level they'll have to compromise. That would either be NATO backing off, or just Russia just admitting that, right, there's nothing I can do, either invade or I go back. Majority of the people in this discussion so far are of the belief that this is a major bluff and they might not go ahead with it. Some of you have been not sure about it. They might not, but the growing belief is that there's an entire bluff that they want to keep pressure on those countries. But let's just say that happens. What are the consequences if there's a failure of efforts in terms of diplomatically, and there is a full-fledged war? What are the global consequences, do you guys think, of an escalation between Russia and Ukraine?
There will be definitely vast consequences if it's like a full-blown invasion. But coming closer to home, if I think about countries that are right now sitting on the fence, for example, India, and how it sat on the fence during the Cold War itself, I think it's going to be a little problematic for countries like India who do not really want to pick sides. They are going to have to pick sides if there's like a full-blown war, or if there's like a full-blown, like all-out invasion of Ukraine from Russia. And also, I feel internationally, we might just go back a few decades, back to the Cold War, where again, there might be two blocks, even though it might not be as intense as it was then, but there definitely would be two blocks with, China already lending its support to Russia, and many of the countries in the Third World having to pick sides. So that would definitely affect the international power scenario.
I'll have to disagree with the block statement, mostly because of like the multipolar nature of cooperation and international diplomacy today. But I do agree with the sentiment behind it that there are allies and enemies, and not necessarily picking sides, but picking which side would suit them best, right? China giving its support to Russia is essentially just um, sort of negating any consequence of sanctions that will be imposed on Russia if they do invade. So it's like it's sort of looking like a win-win situation for Russia if like they want to go ahead with their revisionist policy. I think Russia thrives on bringing about like chaos in, say, Belarus, Ukraine, and their like post-Soviet republics, and that's what really gives them the leverage and the bargaining power over it. And it's going to be an expensive face-off, but only time will tell how that unfolds. I do think it would be interesting to see how the European economy is going to be affected by it, given that there's already rising inflation and post-pandemic recovery is well underway, but it's still underway, right? So yeah, I think it's just going to be a day at a time to see like where this takes us and where it takes Europe versus where it takes China. But the implications are definitely going to be far-reaching. Another like minor tangential point I had is that um, a lot of peace that was brokered between Ukraine and Russia was brought about by the Merkel cabinet. Now that she is not in power, the Scholz cabinet isn't exactly matching up to that, even though there were implications of Merkel's sort of, you know, negotiation between the two countries, but the Minsk II was brokered by her. The Normandy format was led by her. So it's just going to be interesting to see how there's a vacuum there. Merkel could speak Russian. She had close ties to, she was friendly in the sense that, they had to interact often. But to see who's going to fill that vacuum, is it going to be France? Is it going to be the United States? Like it's just a big vacuum that needs to be filled up in order to really advance anywhere, go to the next stage of brokering peace and probably having long-standing peace.
Adding on to what Tanvi just said, the economic blowout wouldn't just be restricted to Eastern Europe. It would also extend its reach to the Central Asian nations like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, etc. That's because a lot of people from these countries migrate to Russia for work, and their remittances constitute a huge proportion of these countries' GDPs. For instance, for Tajikistan, remittances from Russia constitute 30% of their GDP. For Uzbekistan, it's about 12%. So if Russia invades and a war is triggered, even these economies of these countries is gonna squeeze, is gonna be in trouble as well.
All right. Anybody else who has any say on regarding what other global consequences we might have with regards to this being turned into a full-blown escalation? All right, seems like none. The thing is, what I believe is this also widens the ambitions that other countries might have with regards to expanding their territory and strengthening their positions in their strategic locations. And with that, I'm talking about China and Iran, who've had similar ambitions for a very long time, but they've always been that kind of position where, okay, fine, we'll always face pushback in some ways or the other, and there'll always be a diplomatic solution. So I believe that if this was to happen, this kind of creates a ripple effect across the globe with regards to other countries also believing, well, if Russia can, and we are in good partnership with them, especially with China, then definitely we see our expansions and strengthening our positions in this. There's also the question that I think Hemang already brought with regards to Central Asia, but we also have to look towards Western Europe, where you'll have border security issues, where if this happens, because Ukraine strategically is that position between Western Europe and Russia. So if that happens, and if they do take over, there's an entire border security issue that comes in place. So we'll end the discussion with one last question. Let's just say this happens like we've been discussing in this question. And I bought this question previously. I'm just going to end it with this question. Do you guys see UK or USA or France or any other countries coming to the aid of Ukraine if this goes into a war? Will USA risk going into war against Russia by coming to aid for Ukraine?
When talking about the US, I personally do not feel that US would send American troops for the reason that Biden himself is not very keen on that, as has been made evident in what happened in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they have made it pretty clear that we are not really into fighting wars for someone else now. So I feel NATO would definitely be a major part of it, but I don't feel that US would be willing to send American troops for the same.
Adding on to what Ishani just said, we have to consider that the world is still recovering from the pandemics, and all countries are suffering from economic blowout. So at any given what Tanvi said in the starting of this in this discussion, that economies all around the world are integrated. So any kind, if a war breaks out, it's not just the economies of the neighboring countries or other nations participating that will be affected. The whole world would get affected. So, for instance, just because of the threat of the crisis, United States stocks slid. The United States stocks dropped like by a largest percentage in 2 weeks today. And because investors are shifting towards defensive sectors and safe havens. So the point to note here is that any kind of war is going to have huge economic blowouts to every nation. And I don't think any nation is going to come to Ukraine's aid for that.
Tanvi?
So since this is a hypothetical question, just a hypothetical pushback on this, I think this is the stand I've maintained throughout this roundtable, is that I think it's just going to be bringing the world to like the brink of invasion, and that is just going to be in order to gain as much bargaining power they can have, is to like put immense amounts of pressure on global diplomacy and on any other international organization, whether it's the NATO, the EU, or individuals trying to come in and broker peace. I feel like just making it look like they can just gives them an immense sort of upper hand in any discussion that comes about, because in case of an invasion, like I said, Ukraine will not be able to withstand it unless there is aid that like directly comes up to them. And is that a situation that other countries want to risk, making it more vulnerable, making it like, is the war even going to be winnable? Like there's so many factors that go into considering even going to war. So what do the political elites in Russia think? They would be at a disadvantage if Russia goes to war. So I think as long as it's giving them the upper hand, it's fine. But I think building on to what Rakshan said, this is sort of an example for not just like countries like the United States, but also for China, who may be using this as like a blueprint if they want to like amp up their offense towards Taiwan. And I feel like there's just so much that can be discussed on this, and so much that can be just seen as the days go by.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that point, because I think China at this situation is just waiting out to how USA reacts to this, and then will also be like, fine, this is what I will want to do with Taiwan as well, because the USA didn't really push back on this issue. With that, we come to an end to this roundtable discussion. I'd like to thank all the panelists for this engaging discussion, and we would be having more of these and sometime soon as well. Thank you, everyone.